What's up, everyone? Welcome to episode 122 of the Noizze podcast, brought to you by Noizze.co.uk and sponsored by Stereo Brain Records. I'm your host, slash your boy, Kris Pugh, and you will see my compatriot has returned visually, Mr. Samuel Lewis, the cynical one himself. How are we, mate? It's great to see you again.
It's nice to be back. It's nice to be back. I imagine our ratings are going to slump immediately once again as the spike from last week. Try not to be insulted, but overall I'm well, man. It's good to be back visually and auditorially back to the podcast.
At the very least, you're flashing some great drip. That Jordan merch that you picked up, that Jordan long sleeve that you picked up from Chicago. I remember being with you. Was I there when you was that from the Bulls shop?
Yes, yeah, you were, yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to remember because I spent that 45 minutes whizzing around the shop as if it was like last day of term. I was
Yeah,
so
and I
excited.
remember, I remember I was staring at a Jordan jersey for a while. I was like $290 though. I can't.
Yeah,
Two
I couldn't
hundred
even
ninety
I
dollars.
couldn't even justify it to myself. I was like, that's like 3 days here.
Yeah,
Like,
I was like, I can't.
can't be done.
Yeah, I'd want to see his the sweat rings from him doing his whenever he played
I
whenever he
hope I fucking
played
turned
wearing the
into him
shirt.
the moment I put that shirt on.
$290. Like, nah, miss me with that.
Yeah.
We are a rock and metal podcast. We come to you at least once a fortnight with a record that we find particularly interesting. As you can see from today's title, we're going to be talking about a new Dawn Raid record, To Know the Light. Dawn Raid, if you're not familiar, black slash folk metal kind of anarchist band from Liverpool. To Know the Light is the third full-length album and the follow-up to 2019's Behold Sedition Playing Song, and it's out on March 24th via Prosthetic Records. And Sam, the reason why I selected Dawn Raid for us to review, someone I thought, oh, interesting, I'd like to talk about Dawn Raid, not just because they are getting some kind of heat and recognition in British alternative music, but also kind of exciting when we're going to review an album that's different, that we haven't reviewed something of its like either for a while or ever. So, in that sense, there is a sense of uniqueness to this record, isn't there? Like the
Yes.
Dawn Raid, that there is a level of, yeah. If you play this to someone without saying, yeah, it's a black metal folk album, it's hard to actually describe what it sounds like, because black metal and folk does sound like something of an oxymoron.
Mhm.
But I feel like, and I'm not sure how you feel about this, I feel like it's performed well. I actually really enjoy this record. What's your snapshot feeling on To
Yeah, I
Know the
think
Light?
I think as a combination, it's incredibly interesting to listen to, and it does a lot for the listener as an interesting test case into the juxtaposition of those two genres. And it's an odd pairing at first, but it's one that when you think about it, actually kind of makes sense because there's a blurred line between traditional folk music and sort of medieval music, and medieval music is often used as a foil for black metal. So it's kind of just like one step down the road from like a
Yeah.
musical partnership. Listen to a lot of black metal records, and the combination of sort of traditional dark minor medieval style chords used as a way to distract and take pressure away from the song to then lead back into your more traditional black metal tropes is fairly common. So to hear a folk iteration of that does not feel like a complete removal from traditional black metal styles, but is enough of a tweak for it to feel unique within its own right.
I mean, there's parts of this album literally that could play at Temple Bar in Dublin, and there's parts of this album that they could play in Left Hand Path's death metal bar in Copenhagen, which we should be experiencing in 3 weeks' time. Which I
Uh,
think is a really cool thing, and I really really enjoyed this experience.
I enjoyed it less. But I don't disagree that the combination works for the band and offers a unique pathway to sort of appealing to its listeners. I will say that where I think this album shines is where the weight I think is actually geared more towards the folk side than the black metal side. I felt that maybe it sort of reflects my particular relationship with black metal, but I felt like I would have liked to have heard more variations. More variations of black metal than I heard variations of folk music. I actually felt like when they used the folk element of it, the acoustic element, there was a little bit more songwriting. How to describe this? The song construction felt a little bit deeper and more varied and more interesting in that sense. Whereas I felt that the black metal tropes that were used were essentially the same ones. Now, an average listener of black metal might remind me that actually, Sam, that's what great black metal sounds like, and if that's absolutely fine. I'm a self-confessed person in the sense that I'm not a huge black metal fan. But I'd like to have seen a little bit more variety in the metal areas of this album in contrast. Whereas I thought the folk element was actually really, really interesting. If you look over, I'll give you an example on Sepultura, open brackets, don't vote, close brackets.
Well, I think that's the best black metal song on the album. I do, Sepultura.
Yeah, I agree, but I think it's because of the folk metal folk element that gives it an additional sort of expands the palette a little bit. When these songs are just black metal numbers, like the opening of this record, Battle of Sudden Flame and Ancient Light, it feels like they're just rotating between two main ideas. And rather than them blending together, it's here's the black metal bit, here's the folk bit, here's the black metal bit, here's the folk bit. And it doesn't feel blended at all. Whereas further on down the album, songs like Freedom and Retrograde and Wildfire and the concluding song Go As Free Companions, those three I feel are where that blend actually works, because it's black metal that features some elements of folk while the black metal stuff is happening, and then the folk with a little bit of black metal sort of blended together. Whereas when the album just sort of flits between the two like a tennis match, like it does in the opening, I find myself enjoying it a little bit less. Where do you sit with that?
Well, for me, I wanted to specifically speak about Go As Free Companions, and usually we don't really talk about single tracks because obviously people listening to this review if they're a fan of Dawn Raid, they've already heard it. But I think Go As Free Companions is I'm going to use the adjective, Sam. It's a beautiful listen, I think.
Yeah, I would agree.
I kind of just sat there with Go As Free. I listened to it once, and I was like, I'm going to listen to that again and just really sit with this and sink into it. It's got this, like, it's legitimately moving. Go As Free Companions, that it fluctuates tempo, aggression, and heart into this 6 minutes of like unpredictability, love, passion, fight. Pretty stunning stuff, I've got to say. Now, when you mentioned earlier about the idea of the tennis match between folk metal and black metal not massively working for you, I do understand where you're coming from. And I think Freedom in Retrograde, though, I think the folk metal that they use, it's a really nice conduit for their message, though, and I think it works because they're like this anarchistic band that talk about like the idea of fighting back against our oppressors, and because folk is such a, I don't know. Melodramatic's not the right word, but I don't think I've ever heard a folk song that I've noticed addressing anything other than the idea of love or passion or general enjoyment of a subject. And I think it's really cool that they use folk as actually an aggressor. And it's intelligent, and I think it's a really nice conduit. And when that black metal then appears from this conduit of the juxtaposition of usually pleasurable sounds of folk with underlying tones of aggression and fight, I think it actually works really, really well. And I, in particular, things like In the Shadow of the Past, which is your more out and out black metal song, really raking vocals that anchor the slow tempo of the guitar build. I think both of those elements really work.
Yeah, I understand what you're trying to say. Actually, I like the sort of juxtaposition of the negativity of the lyrics and the folk styles. It's almost reminiscent of the more political folk movement in that sense that we sort of got in the 1960s with Bob Dylan and John Baez and stuff like that. But obviously with this Northern Irish twang that sort of infects some of their songs, and obviously sort of explains a little bit of the decision making when it comes to the music pathways sort of overlapping there. I agree. I really enjoyed that final track, Go As Free Companions. I think it was the highlight of the album, but that's almost the point. I felt that there weren't many songs on the album that replicated the kind of thing that song was doing. In the sense that I did feel a little empty from some of the earlier tracks. And when I got to that, I was like, where was this earlier? where was this throughout the rest of the album? That felt a little bit disappointing to me. Like by the point that I got to Inferno, it felt that the songs were following a very similar blueprint with a quick, open, clean, straight into the blast beats, straight into a chorus, back into the blast beats, and then the open melody returns to sort of like tie this little circular narrative together at the end. And I felt that worked a couple of times, but I felt that repeating that structure over and over again did the album's creativity a disservice. Whereas I thought later on it actually seemed to grow into its own. Like for example, I'll talk again about Freedom in Retrograde. I thought the mix here with this is where I enjoyed it. The conclusion of this, because it had the acoustic intro and then it had the black metal section, but at the end it had, oh, let's do some stuff with some guitars and some real drums and some real pace, but then mix it in with piano and violin and a circular melody as well, and that added a sense of depth, to the point that when I went back to the other areas, that in contrast felt a little bit empty. I don't mind the mix at all. I would just prefer that it was an actual mix, an actual blend, something that shows the cocktail of the band here, because I think that's where the band are at their best on this album. I think it's an incredibly interesting listen. And if you're a black metal fan, I've got to assume that this is a warm, refreshing moment for you as a black metal fan, because like we talked about before, we talked about this with hardcore bands, with metalcore bands, with death metal bands. Really, the list can go on and on and on. Thrash metal, most significantly, where you don't have to reinvent the wheel necessarily to become successful at this genre. But if you're going to repeat exactly the same motions as previously successful artists, you're never going to match up. Like, if you're going to just do black metal, are you ever going to get better than Opeth? Probably not. It's probably, or at least a progressive black metal, people might pick hairs, whatever. But there's black metal stylings on those famous Opeth records. Same with Cradle of Filth, and same with some of the others, like bands like Entombed and all that sort of rest of it. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that where you take the genre forward is not completely reinventing the wheel, but inserting different ingredients into the melting pot a little bit and taking it one step forward. And I like the fact that the band actually did that, because I've got to imagine that we're running out of black metal albums that are great, that repeat the things that made previous black metal albums great, in the same way that we talk about thrash and metalcore. You've got to move the boat out just a little bit. And I feel that at the very least, even though black metal's not my favorite genre in the world, and folk music is not my favorite genre in the world either, I like the blend here and I like what the band are trying to do. And I think there's some significant progress being made here in terms of what they're trying to do for themselves and by extension the genre that they sit within.
Well, you mentioned the idea of the album following a similar blueprint throughout, and I also picked up on that. But what I liked about it is, yes, it does follow this blueprint, but the blueprint is just slightly shifted per track. Like most songs uses the opening riff as a motif throughout, but because the opening riff is manipulated in different ways for different songs, for me that didn't become cumbersome or tiresome. You mentioned the Battle of the Southern Flame. That's got that classic black metal opening. The atmospheric trio of blast beats and rasping vocals, but it's got a really nice guitar tone. It's got a really beautiful tempo and instrumental change in middle 8. And then they use that intro guitar as the motif behind a gang vocal chant to bring it out. And that song, The Battle of Southern Flame, that idea is kind of repeated throughout. But then the opening is in possibly a different octave, or the instrumental is perhaps of a different length, or perhaps of a different tonality, and because of that, it still maintain my interest throughout. You mentioned like Inferno. I kind of liked Inferno's more oppressed atmospheric opening. I think the album's really good at creating. I'll put in inverted commas, anticipation, in a sense. I think those are the 3 opening tracks, Battle of Sun and Flame, Ancient Light, and Inferno, all explode out of the gate, all use an atmospheric middle 8, all return to the opening riff as a motif. But as I mentioned, it brings its own unique style to each element, and it's got a really nice pulsating, aggressive end to the song. What did you think of the spoken word tracks? As I was listening to them, I thought Sam's going to hate these. What did you think of them?
I didn't hate them.
Like Cruel Optimisms, for example. I thought Sam's going to find this really, really frustrating. Just from how I know you, how did you find like the likes of Cruel Optimisms?
No, it was okay, because it actually worked in the context of what they were trying to do.
Yeah.
The like I don't like spoken word intros when it just seems to be like tokenistic, or it just sort of let's just find a way of making it seem like we've got depth and like real emotional. Let's just say our lyrics instead. And the lyrics are always really bad and it's emphasized by the spoken word decision. Whereas this, nice open dystopian violin. This feels like in 10 years I'm going to see this on a TV episode.
Yeah.
In the backdrop of like a dramatic moment. It felt like a bit like something out of Game of Thrones or Vikings or one of those kind of medieval type shows. And it I mean that as a compliment. Like it feels really cinematic. And when that is put there, the backdrop combination of that with the spoken word stuff really makes a lot of sense because it kind of fits the dramatic film score feel to that particular song. Yes, it's when you put it in a different sort of section that it really missed me with that. But this particular element actually really works. And it helped, I think. Same with like The Shadow of the Past, the following song. I really like the intro. The album seems to get more progressive as it goes along at that point. And the country stuff there with the structure and the build up to that felt like vaguely uplifting. And I thought that element was a real breakthrough for the band. And actually, as the album goes on, it seems that rather than two sort of distant cousins, by the end they do feel more like real siblings, sort of rotating with each other throughout the album.
Just one final thing from me.
Yeah.
I think this album would have some really great moments live. I think Freedom in Retrograde would be a great moment live. And then going, if they bled that straight into Go as Free Companions, that could be really, as you said, cinematic and a beautiful moment. Cruel Optimisms as well. I can imagine that gang spoken word vocal being echoed out live in a small intimate venue with maybe 100, 150 people there. Perhaps all singing along as well. Because like I say, Dawn Raid's message of anarchism and fighting back against the oppressors. Obviously, it is quite easy to align to, especially from, they're from Liverpool, for your working class areas. They are naturally going to align and going to really like understand and feel fulfillment from that perspective. So I think that like this is the kind of album that would be like really brilliant live. And off the top of my head, I can't remember actually if Dawn Raider are Download or Bloodstock, but if they were announced or if they are, I would specifically go out of my way to try and catch them because I think this would be quite an experience live.
Right? This feels like a
yeah.
band.
If I had to guess, I'd imagine Bloodstock more than Download. But I would specifically go out of my way to try and catch them because I think this would be quite an experience live. I'm a big fan of this album and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I like it. I like it a lot in parts too. I think that it's got some real depth to it. That it's definitely attempting. And near the conclusion of this album, I really feel that blend actually pays off. And I agree with you. It's got some gravity live. I can see where it's taking the genre moving forwards, and I think it's an overall positive for this band. If you're a black metal fan, this is surely a great album to listen to. Felt a little bit like, as a side note, a little bit like early Pallbearer, like a little bit like the misanthropic area, the group vocal element, the slow builds and the structures. Obviously, Pallbearer, whatever, a little bit more metal centered, and they sort of veer towards more guitar led stuff. Whereas obviously, these guys are sort of veering towards folk and things. I just think that there's clearly an audience here for that, and I think this is a good step for them.
So that's where we're going to leave it for episode 122 of the Noizze podcast. To Know the Light by Dawn Raid is out on March 24th via Prosthetic Records. Me and Sam, depending on when you are on YouTube, we will also be releasing a review of the new August Burns Red record on the same day. So if you're an August Burns Red fan, look on the channel and you should see release on the same day as this Dawn Raid review, our review of the new August Burns Red record. Dead Below. To support us, you can like/subscribe depending on whichever service you are using. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcast, we will be there. Thank you so much for listening. Dawn Raid Now the Light is out on March 24th via Prosthetic Records. For me, great record. Go and listen to it. Really like expansive, beautiful black metal album. with folk metal tropes in there as well. We will be back in at least 2 weeks' time, or actually next week. We'll be talking about the new Bury Tomorrow album, or if you're an August Burns Red fan, stay on the channel. Our review of Death Below will also be there. We will see you soon. Thank you for listening. Bye.